In the middle of a neighborhood defined by rigid conformity, where nearly every house looked identical, one property stood out. It wasn't because of bright paint or unusual landscaping, but because of its long, winding driveway that stretched far deeper than any of the others. The concrete path cut straight back, wide enough for multiple vehicles, and ended in a generous turnaround space near the garage. To most, it was nothing more than a practical luxury, but to the Homeowners Association, it was an offense waiting to be catalogued. The homeowner had always considered the driveway an asset, a simple feature of the property that made life easier. Delivery trucks had space to turn without trampling grass. Relatives could visit without worrying about parking on the street. Even contractors found it convenient when coming to perform work. For years, no one said anything about it. Neighbors occasionally commented that it was handy or joked about borrowing the extra space when their driveways overflowed with guests. Everything seemed harmless. But the HOA thrived on hunting for problems where none existed. They were not content with maintaining the neighborhood's collective appearance. They relished the ability to control details, to dictate rules, to enforce conformity with threats of fines and sternly worded letters. They prided themselves on finding flaws, and eventually, their attention turned toward the long driveway. The first complaints arrived subtly, tucked into meeting notes that circulated through the neighborhood. Words like non-standard and detracting from uniformity were used, coded terms that masked the real sentiment. Someone on the board disliked that the driveway was different. Shortly after, a letter arrived stamped with the HOA's insignia, declaring the driveway non-compliant. The reasoning was vague, citing neighborhood aesthetic balance and suggesting it set an undesirable precedent. At first, the homeowner laughed it off. The driveway had been part of the property long before the HOA existed, a permanent structure poured and permitted. Yet, the HOA had a way of escalating minor concerns into crusades. More letters came, each one threatening fines for failure to remedy the violation. The absurdity was clear. The driveway wasn't broken, illegal, or dangerous. It was simply longer than the others, and that seemed to be enough to spark outrage among the board. Tension grew as board members began to fixate on the driveway at meetings. Neighbors who had never noticed it suddenly felt pressured to form opinions. Some whispered about how it made the street look uneven. Others, emboldened by the HOA's disapproval, suggested it might lower property values. The entire issue snowballed from insignificance into a hot topic of debate. Meanwhile, the homeowner began to view the situation differently. Instead of shrinking under the HOA's pressure, he started considering what could be done with the space. If the board claimed the driveway was too long, perhaps it could become more than just concrete. He noticed the scarcity of parking in the neighborhood, especially during evenings when residents returned home from work or during weekends when families hosted gatherings. Cars lined the narrow curbs, creating traffic obstacles. Guests often had to park blocks away, trudging through the neighborhood to reach their destinations. That's when the idea first formed. What if the HOA's complaints could be turned into an opportunity? What if the long driveway, condemned as an eyesore, became a solution for the neighborhood's parking woes? The thought lingered, first as a joke, then as a serious possibility. The homeowner researched local ordinances, finding nothing that explicitly forbade renting driveway space. Apps and websites even existed for people to lease their unused parking to others, particularly in crowded areas. The more he read, the clearer it became. The driveway the HOA hated so much could become a source of income. Still, he knew such a move would provoke outrage. The HOA already despised the driveway for existing. Monetizing it would push their anger into overdrive. But the temptation was too strong. Instead of feeling trapped, the homeowner felt empowered. If the HOA insisted the driveway was a problem, then it would be a problem they couldn't control. The first step was quiet. A discreet listing went live online, offering the driveway as private parking for a modest monthly fee. Almost immediately, there was interest. A young couple in the neighborhood, constantly battling for street parking, signed up. Soon after, a retiree with frequent visitors joined in. One by one, neighbors began using the driveway, happy to pay for convenience and security. It started small, 2 cars parked neatly on the side, but quickly grew. The demand was higher than expected. Within weeks, the driveway became a reliable fixture of neighborhood life. Cars rotated in and out, always orderly, always respectful. For residents frustrated with the HOA's strict parking rules, the driveway became a quiet act of rebellion and relief. Of course, it didn't take long for the board to notice. HOA members drove past slowly, eyes narrowing at the unfamiliar vehicles. They snapped photos, scribbled notes, and muttered among themselves. Soon, fresh violation letters appeared, this time accusing the homeowner of commercial use of residential property. They demanded immediate termination of the operation and threatened escalating fines. Yet for every letter the board sent, the homeowner felt bolstered by the growing support of his neighbors. Word spread that the HOA was furious, but residents loved the convenience. More cars signed up, and the driveway became fully occupied, bringing in steady monthly income. The HOA had hoped to isolate and pressure, but instead their attack had highlighted just how valuable the driveway really was. As the board scrambled to build a case, the homeowner prepared for what was coming. He knew the HOA would not stop at letters. They would escalate to hearings, fines, and even court if necessary. But by now, the driveway was more than concrete. It was a statement, a symbol of defiance and the start of something bigger than anyone had anticipated. The battle lines were drawn. On one side stood the HOA, red-faced and furious, clutching rule books and violation slips. On the other side stood the homeowner, arms folded, backed by neighbors who had grown tired of arbitrary restrictions. The driveway, once ordinary, had become the center of a war that was about to engulf the neighborhood. And with each new car that rolled onto the concrete, the HOA's outrage only grew louder. What they thought would be a simple complaint had transformed into a full-blown rebellion, and there was no turning back. The fight over a driveway had just begun, and it was already spiraling far beyond anything the board had imagined. The complaints escalated with astonishing speed. What had begun as stern letters in the mailbox soon turned into full-page violation notices, threats of escalating fines, and demands for immediate corrective action. The HOA's president, a woman who relished her role with the ferocity of a gatekeeper, became visibly obsessed with the driveway. She paced its length during early morning walks, scribbling notes on a clipboard. She stopped her car at odd hours to take photos of the vehicles parked there. To the board, the driveway had become a symbol of rebellion, and they were determined to crush it. The homeowner, however, was unmoved. The income was steady and surprisingly lucrative. Each month, envelopes arrived with cash or transfers appeared through apps, proof that his neighbors valued the convenience far more than they valued the HOA's sense of uniformity. Cars parked neatly in rows, never blocking sidewalks, never obstructing traffic, always respectful of the property. It was the opposite of the chaos the board claimed, yet the more orderly it looked, the more the HOA seethed. The HOA board called an emergency meeting. In whispered conversations that spread through the neighborhood, residents learned that the driveway issue dominated the entire agenda. The board declared the parking operation a commercial enterprise that violated the covenants of the neighborhood. They proposed daily fines that would accumulate relentlessly until the practice stopped. Letters bearing bold numbers and highlighted sections of bylaws soon arrived at the homeowner's door. At first, the fines were symbolic, $50 here, $100 there. But as the weeks passed, they ballooned, each letter claiming hundreds more owed. The HOA piled violation upon violation, hoping the sheer weight of the penalties would break the homeowner's resolve. But something unexpected happened. Rather than discouraging him, the campaign fueled a growing solidarity among the residents. Many were weary of the board's overreach. They had lived under constant pressure for years. Lawns measured to regulation length, shutters painted only in pre-approved shades, trash cans hidden behind fences, or else punished with fines. To them, the driveway had become a small rebellion they could participate in simply by parking their car. Each vehicle that rolled into the space felt like a quiet protest against the suffocating rules. Neighbors rallied, some even volunteering to pay a little extra just to keep the operation going. For the first time, the homeowner realized he wasn't fighting alone. What had begun as a personal response to an absurd complaint had turned into a community movement. The HOA, enraged by the growing defiance, escalated further. They hired a law firm, sending official-looking documents filled with legal jargon meant to intimidate. The letters threatened lawsuits, liens on the property, and claims of covenant breaches that could strip the homeowner of privileges. The tone was aggressive, dripping with warnings of inevitable defeat. Still, the homeowner stood firm. He began researching his own rights, digging into the original property deeds, city zoning laws, and even precedents from past court cases. To his surprise, the driveway was fully legal, grandfathered in from before the HOA's formation. There was no covenant violation, no illegal business operation. Renting parking spaces wasn't prohibited under city code, and nothing in the HOA's rules gave them power to restrict it. The board's threats were bluffs, dressed in the costume of authority, but lacking substance. As the HOA scrambled to assert dominance, the homeowner leaned into the opportunity. He expanded the listings, allowing commuters from nearby apartment complexes to rent spots as well. The driveway became fully booked, often with a waiting list. Cars came and went with clockwork precision, their presence a constant reminder of the board's failure to enforce its will. The board retaliated with theatrics. They sent members to patrol the street, standing at the end of the driveway and writing down license plate numbers. They knocked on doors, demanding residents stop renting spaces, and threatened anyone who participated. But instead of instilling fear, their antics bred resentment. Whispers spread like wildfire across the neighborhood. Longtime residents shared stories of past abuses, fines for flowers planted in the wrong color, penalties for children's toys left outside overnight, violations for fences built an inch too high. The driveway fight became the spark that lit a larger fire. Homeowners who had stayed silent for years began to question the authority of the board. They attended meetings, challenged the rules, and demanded accountability. The HOA doubled down, calling the police to report illegal parking. But when officers arrived, they found no violations. Cars were parked entirely on private property, with no laws broken. Each failed attempt only made the board look weaker. By now the battle lines were clear. On one side stood the HOA, furious and desperate, throwing every tool of intimidation they had. On the other stood the homeowner, backed by neighbors who saw him not just as someone renting a driveway, but as someone standing up to the tyranny they all endured. The tension reached a boiling point one summer evening when the board staged an inspection. Clipboards in hand, they marched down the street in a public display, pointing at the driveway and muttering loud enough for everyone to hear. Neighbors watched from porches, whispering and shaking their heads. Cars lined the driveway as usual, shining in the sunlight, each one a visible reminder of the board's failure. By the time the inspection ended, the neighborhood had taken sides. Some stood behind the board, fearful of losing the HOA's iron grip on property values. But far more stood behind the homeowner, tired of living under constant threat. The conflict had grown beyond the length of one driveway. It had become a referendum on the entire system of control. The board prepared for the next phase, legal action. Their letters promised court filings, injunctions, and relentless pursuit. They believed the homeowner would eventually buckle under the weight of legal fees and pressure. But they underestimated both his resolve and the growing power of public opinion. As summer faded into fall, the story of the driveway began to spread beyond the neighborhood. Word of mouth carried it across town. Social media posts mocked the HOA, praising the creativity of turning a too-long driveway into a profitable venture. Photos of the cars neatly lined up went viral, captioned with sarcastic remarks about ruining the neighborhood's image. The HOA, once confident in its ability to silence dissent, now found itself the subject of ridicule. The board had not just picked a fight, it had picked the wrong fight, one that drew attention they could no longer control. The driveway was more than a strip of concrete now. It was a stage, a battleground, and a symbol of resistance. Each car parked there wasn't just a vehicle, it was a statement. And as the HOA prepared to drag the homeowner into court, the neighborhood watched, waiting for the next chapter in the war that had begun with nothing more than a strip of concrete. As the weeks passed, the conflict between the homeowner and the HOA escalated into something no one in the community could ignore. What had begun as a simple complaint about the length of a driveway had snowballed into an ongoing battle of principles, pride, and persistence. The homeowner had turned an ordinary slab of concrete into a lifeline for neighbors who struggled to find parking in a tightly packed subdivision. What the HOA viewed as a violation, the community began to see as a solution. Every weekend, the driveway was filled with vehicles, some belonging to guests visiting residents, others belonging to families who simply couldn't fit all their cars in their cramped garages and narrow, designated spaces. The neighborhood streets, once clogged with parked cars spilling onto curbs and corners, became more navigable. Delivery trucks had an easier time driving through, children could ride their bikes more safely, and overnight residents finally stopped worrying about tickets or towing threats. Ironically, what the HOA had labeled as a nuisance had quickly become the most appreciated amenity in the neighborhood. Word of mouth spread, and soon neighbors who had never spoken to the homeowner before were stopping by, waving, and even slipping thank you notes under the door. The driveway had become more than concrete. It had become a quiet act of defiance that grew into a shared service for the community. But the HOA board wasn't satisfied with letting the situation play out naturally. They doubled down, issuing more violation notices, upping fines, and threatening legal action. They sent letters filled with legal jargon, warnings of potential liens, and reminders that the community bylaws were not negotiable. To them, this was no longer just about a driveway. It was about control. They feared that if one homeowner was allowed to bend the rules, others would follow suit. Despite the mounting pressure, the homeowner remained steady. By now, the rental income from the driveway had become significant, not enough to make anyone rich, but enough to cover HOA dues, utility bills, and a portion of the mortgage. What the HOA had intended as punishment had backfired spectacularly, because instead of deterring the homeowner, their persistence had created a financial incentive to continue. Each threat letter became less intimidating when offset by deposits rolling in each month. The breaking point came when the HOA decided to host an emergency community meeting. Flyers were posted, emails were sent, and board members went door to door reminding residents of the importance of restoring order. The meeting was held in the clubhouse and it was packed. Dozens of neighbors showed up, many carrying frustrations that extended far beyond the issue of one driveway. When the board laid out their case, residents began murmuring. Some shook their heads, others outright laughed. The irony was clear. The very people the board claimed to represent were not siding with them. Instead, they expressed gratitude to the homeowner, recounting their personal experiences with using the driveway and explaining how it had made daily life easier. Some even spoke about how the situation highlighted bigger problems in the neighborhood, like inadequate parking design and rigid rules that didn't reflect the realities of modern families. For the first time, the board found itself on the defensive. Their authority, once unquestioned, was now openly challenged. The community wasn't just passively listening, they were actively pushing back. By the end of the meeting, what was meant to be a condemnation of one homeowner turned into a broader conversation about reform. Petitions were circulated, signatures gathered, and residents demanded changes to the bylaws that had been enforced with such rigidity. The homeowner didn't gloat, didn't argue, and didn't grandstand. They simply let the room speak for itself. What had once been a lonely standoff had transformed into a collective awakening. The driveway was no longer just a personal victory. It was a symbol of how a community could reclaim power from a board that had forgotten its purpose. In the weeks that followed, the momentum only grew. Neighbors organized committees, new candidates ran for board positions, and the once intimidating HOA realized they were now under the microscope. The fines that had been issued were quietly rescinded, the threats of liens vanished, and the so-called violation was no longer mentioned in official communications. The board, eager to save face, shifted its narrative, claiming it had simply been enforcing outdated rules and was always open to feedback. But the neighborhood remembered. They remembered how quickly the HOA had tried to punish one of their own, and they remembered how it had taken solidarity to reverse the tide. And most importantly, they remembered how one homeowner's resilience had sparked a chain reaction that permanently changed the way their community was governed. The driveway continued to operate as a rental space, though with time demand lessened. With updated parking allowances and better planning from the new HOA leadership, residents didn't struggle as much to find spots. But the story of the driveway remained, retold at block parties, mentioned in hushed tones to new residents, and even used as an example in other communities of what could happen when rules were enforced without reason. By the end, The homeowner hadn't just kept their driveway. They had earned something far greater. They had proven that standing up, even against a powerful board, could ripple outward until an entire community found its voice. And so what began as a petty battle over the length of concrete ended as a testament to persistence, solidarity, and the quiet but powerful resistance of ordinary people unwilling to be bullied into submission. The HOA had wanted compliance. Instead, they got reform. The driveway, once seen as a problem, became the symbol of a neighborhood finally learning to stand together. And that was the unexpected twist. The homeowner had not only kept the driveway, but had also, in a very real sense, paved the way for change.